I mostly work on the editor, the extension host, and core remoting functionality.
I'm a PM on the VS Code team working on remote development.
I do demos. That's all I do. And PowerPoint slides. Yeah.
Right now, I mostly work on debugging, profiling, and testing.
I mostly work on the terminal and setting sync.
I'm working on the language server protocol and the language server index format.
I'm a software engineer working on VS Code, most recently on the terminal.
I work on VS Code's JavaScript and TypeScript support, along with API features such as the web view.
I'm a software engineer working on VS Code's generic debugger and the debug adapter protocol.
I'm a developer on the remote containers extension,
Git integration, timeline view, and with our extension author community.
I mainly work on search and our GitHub automation.
I'm a designer on the VS Code team. I work on all the UI, UX, and iconography.
I'm a software engineer working on notebook and editor support in VS Code.
I work on authentication, issue reporting, and the GitHub pull requests and issues extension.
And I'm a software engineer working on the Emmet extension for VS Code.
I mainly work on the remote SSH extension, settings editor, search, and notebooks.
I work on making the editor more useful for students, educators, and folks new to coding.
I work on setting sync, configuration and extension management, and other workbench features.
Welcome to VS Code Day.
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 And welcome to VS Code Day.
Without further ado, let me introduce our keynote speaker. So on the weekends, he enjoys extreme skiing down treacherous mountains, but during the week, he enjoys extreme development by creating VS Code with his team. Let's get a round of applause for Erich Gamma, technical fellow at Microsoft and your keynote speaker.
Hello and welcome to VS Code Day. As Brian mentioned, the title of the talk is VS Code is an overnight success. That's what many people think, but what these people forget or don't know, that it was actually more than 10 years in the making. And it's my big pleasure now in this talk to shed some light in what happened in these 10 years and what this great team that you saw in the intro has built. So without further ado, how did it all get started, right? So I joined Microsoft almost 10 years ago. And from my manager, I got kind of this job description that I should really work on online development tooling. Well, in fact, that's why I joined Microsoft, because I was interested in that. I simplified then the description to just focus on enable coding in the browser with the sub-sentence that so that you don't feel like you're coding in the browser, right? Because we don't want to be restricted. We want to have a cool coding experience. That's what we are all about. So that was the mission. And the other idea was that we really run as a startup, right? We were a small team in Zurich. And when you run as a startup, you have to think about your deliverables, right? Because you want to be relevant and kind of you want to get funding. And the first thing we built to get funding was what became the Monaco editor. And the Monaco editor was a well-performing editor that leverages the latest HTML5 technology, gives you coloring, IntelliSense, code, and a rich coding experience. What many people don't know is that we decided to not use any UI frameworks from the beginning, and that's still true today, because performance is very important to us, and we want to be fully in control of our own destiny, right? So we don't want to chase a framework or track some performance from in the framework. We want to be directly as close to the DOM as possible. So that was Monaco. We shipped that. The good thing, as a startup, we found partners, right? Monaco got adopted by Azure early on and others. And even today, you see Monaco embedded in many applications, which is great. Internally, we're more aggressive, right? We immediately said, well, if you build this editor, we want to dogfood it as much as possible. And we really want to work towards a web IDE, that we can do full development in the browser. And that led into the Monaco Workbench, which was our internal dogfooding IDE that we built and run locally, right? We had some kind of Express server that we connect to, and then that's how we developed it. In order to not lose any work, we always had autosave enabled. This was one of the most important features we had there, right? So autosave, never lose your work. And interestingly, we never have the guts to change the default in VS Code to autosave, right? But it's a great feature. I think everybody in the team has it enabled. So as a good startup, of course, you want to ship. I mean, you also wanted to ship this workbench. And finally, before we go to the shipping the workbench, the story would not be complete without showing and give some kisses to TypeScript, right? Because this 10 years journey wouldn't have been possible unless we had TypeScript as the tool that helped us to keep our code flexible so they can restructure it. And as you see here, we slowly started the adoption of TypeScript, and as the code base grew, we found more and more compelling desire to have everything in TypeScript. And in the last 10 years, right, we refactored major parts of the system, like the editor storage or the tree widget, to really for performance. And this would not have been possible unless we had TypeScript. So in 2013, we were all into TypeScript. So also in this time, by 2013, we were ready to ship this workbench in the product. And this was then what we called Visual Studio Online Monaco, which allowed you to edit Azure websites online. And if you look at the screen, you see we had kind of an explorer, we had Git integration, search, you could run your program, and so on. This is all good, we were very happy. But also for a startup, right, when it came to number of users, we have some happy users, but what the most we got was about 3,000 monthly users. And for Microsoft, it's very hard to be relevant with this number of users. So we had the classical startup challenge that we really had to grow by 10x, right? In fact, by us, it was by 100x more users. The only highlight, I think, from this effort was that even the little kingdom got aware of this effort, and they wrote us a letter that they really don't like the name, which we promptly reacted to by putting Monaco in quotes, right? Okay, so that was Visual Studio Online Monaco. And now we had to decide, we want to get to more users, right? What do we do? Do we continue pushing or do we pivot? And the good thing is, at that time, Microsoft changed fundamentally, right? Microsoft as a company moved from run everything on Windows to a cross-platform company. Even Azure, not surprising, right? And also, Microsoft wants to be more open and be attractive to many developers, embracing open source, embracing open standards. So what we did based on that, given desire, we said we want to build a tool that is cross-platform and it targets born-on-the-web developers, right? And these born-on-the-web developers, they use many languages, many tools, many different runtimes. So we want to be attractive to them. The challenge is, we said we want to also have it done by 2015. We were very conference-driven initially, right? For each conference, we'd like to, also as a startup, to get some visibility, right? And Build was the most visible conference, and that's why we were shooting for that. So the next question was, well, what tool do we build? And on one hand, right, born-in-the-web developers, they use editors, right? They like Sublime, Atom, whatever, right? We had some background in IDEs, which we also like. We like code understanding. We enjoy debugging. So what we wanted to do is we really want to build a tool that is kind of in the sweet spot in between and that addresses the challenge of supporting many languages, right? You will see this as a common theme as we evolve further. So the next challenge was we had to get from the browser to the desktop. And again, kind of the timing was just lucky for us because at that time, 2014, frameworks emerged which allowed you to develop a desktop application with web technology, right? So there was kind of Node WebKit came along, Atom Shell, which then finally became Electron. And we jumped on Atom Shell because it had a great community, and we were very happy with that, right? And Electron improves with every release and allows us to run and build a tool that runs on cross-platform with minimal cross-platform testing effort. In fact, but we still dog food. Our team runs on all the different platforms we ship on. So that's kind of also part of our story that we go with Electron to get to the desktop. And in fact, no, we were able to ship that, which was a very happy moment. We had kind of this checklist. So we said, what do we have all to do to ship the preview? And by May, we were able to do that. It wasn't announced, and it was demoed, and the coolest demo was to demo Linux debugging, .NET debugging on Linux, right? This was really great. So we got lots of great feedback that we are cross-platform, but what people really wanted is an extension story, and it should be open source. We also remind it should be open source because we cannot build all the languages born in the web developer world, support for all these languages, right? So we had to do that, and since we're conference driven, we said we want to do it by the next conference. Unfortunately, this conference was just 6 months ahead of us. So this was the Connect conference. But again, no, it was very intense, and we got it together, and we came up with an extension story. And on the right, you see extensions that were demoed at that time, and an extension API. There was kind of pretty interesting discussion about this, how we support extensions, because we have some experience from extensions in the past and other tools like Eclipse, that extensions are really cool, but extensions can also hurt you, right? Because when an extension on startup does too much, all of a sudden your tool starts slowly, right? And it delays until the cursor starts blinking. And our goal is always in VS Code, we really care. We want to get that the cursor blinks as soon as possible, and we don't want to be kind of impacted in any way from an extension for doing that. So what we then decided to do is we decided to run extensions in a separate process so that the VS Code core is less impacted by extensions. For instance, right, in the VS Code core, save happens in the core. So an extension that does some weird things or has problems cannot impact the saving, which is a great thing. Also, the API was designed from the ground up. What do we expose to extensions? Because we had the separations, we talked to some RPC to this what we call the extension host. And this API is, again, leveraging TypeScript, nicely specified in the VS Code.d.ts. And also this separation allows us now to shield kind of the extension authors from internal implementation details. And probably what not many of you knows, right? For instance, in the VS Code core, we address lines and columns in the editor based on a one-based index. In the extension API, because we found it's more natural, we fixed that, and you can address lines and columns at zero-based, right? So we can nicely shield and hide what we want to do for the extension, also make their life simple from what we have implemented in the code. So this extension host you will see is a continuous theme as we evolve VS Code. And the cool demo there at this conference was that we showed the Go extension, which showed for the first time some language intelligence and was really implemented as an extension. Good. Open source, yes, it was announced as well, same time. So what we also did during these 6 months, we not only came with the extension architecture, we also came up with cleansed code, right? So we had to really review our code. We had a long checklist we went through, what you have to do to be, so that everybody could see our code. And we did that. And one of the things we did there also, we used this open source pattern to have an open source core and then build a distro on top of it, which bonds additional product-specific things that you don't want to share open source, like the Visual Studio graphics and so on, which are proprietary. So we made it all happen, and this was pretty good. And we were very happy at that point. So what was the next challenge we wanted to solve? So as I told you, born in the web developers use many languages. What we like from IDEs, we like rich language understanding, right? So that you can go to definition or get IntelliSense. So the challenge was, how do we get support and rich language support for many languages in VS Code? Now, we know that we will not appeal to every language developer if a language provider, if there's implementation is only good for VS Code. So for that reason, what we came up with is the language server protocol. So first of all, the first step is that you embed or encapsulate the language brains, the language intelligence in a separate server. And now to help the language provider to make their life easier, they don't have to integrate this language server then for each different tool, because each tool has a different API. So the idea was we kind of standardize the protocol that the tool talks to this language server, to the language intelligence, right? So the language server is basically has to know when a file gets opened, because then the truth of the file of the language is in the editor in memory, and the language server protocol has to synchronize the editor state. And when a language request like go to definition comes along, the language server will reply to this request. And this is a JSON RPC-based protocol. And the first success story of this language server protocol is support for Java. which kind of closes a nice circle, right? Because several of our team, they worked on the Eclipse Java. And what we did in a hackathon with Red Hat, we implemented a Java language server using the LSP protocol. And through that, we got Java support in VS Code. And the support is getting better and better since then. So it's a nice little loop we had and a nice little success story of this language server protocol. So at that point, now we were open source. We had more languages. We noticed we need some more power. And another timing and nice thing happened at that time. We decided that we want to really grow from this small team in Zurich, and we want to have a team also in Redmond, right? And it was really lucky that Kai Metzel, someone I worked with many years at Eclipse, he finished his startup journey and he joined us in Microsoft and built a team in Redmond. Right. And the team immediately started to contribute. And one of the initial contributions was this integrated terminal, right, based on Xterm.js, which was really great to see. So like both teams collaborate. And of course, by now you cannot say what the one team or the other does because it's really just we succeed together. But what this integrated terminal shows also is that our team not only maintains VS Code, we also maintain components like the Monaco editor or the Xterm.js that are really appreciated by many other tools, and you see them embedded in many different setups. So then came this planning meeting, right? We were open source with extensions. We were pretty happy, but the question was, where do we want to go next? And one scenario we really liked and appealed to us since a long time was, what if you want to work on a repository, let's say the GitHub repository, and what if you could just say, open me this repository in VS Code, and you can press F5 to run it. You can make changes, create a pull request, and you're happy, right? So that was a scenario that we thought is very appealing, but it was clear to us it's a longer journey to get there because first you want to maybe run in a browser and you need to write a story for extensions in the setup that the browser can use these extensions. Again, timing was pretty nice because a new challenge came along, and the challenge was that Microsoft provided WSL, the Windows subsystem for Linux, right? And the Windows subsystem for Linux allows you to install tools in the subsystem on the Linux side. And now when we have our extensions, we'd like to have extensions which can leverage tools installed in the WSL side. So, and this was a challenge because we noticed if we do it the way without any special architectural change, you have to do lots of path mappings, right? Which is really not sustainable. So when you want to launch Node in the extension, you have to know you're in WSL. If you're in WSL, you know the path on the WSL side. So this was not really appealing. But what if you could run extensions remotely on the side where the tools are? And that has led us to this VS Code remote architecture. And the idea is that we support that you can run extensions remotely. Right? So we have basically another remote extension host that runs on the remote side where the file system is, where the tools are installed. And basically what we implement is that the VS Code core talks to an agent which manages this remote extension host, which is the same bits as the local extension host and can host extensions like Git or Python. But the cool thing is, when you use the Python extension, it will leverage the Python installed on the remote side. Now this architecture, which we call here is the VS Code server, this combo of agent and extension host, can now be applied to different setups. And these are the setups we initially implemented. WSL was the initial motivation. Then we found another interesting scenario is that you want to run your development tools in a container, in a Docker container. That's the remote container setup. There will be a talk right after this one that goes deeper into that. And the next setup is SSH, right? SSH, you have an SSH box where you want to do remote development or whatever. And you not only want to connect with Vim or to this tool to edit files, but you want to basically use the full VS Code to develop and work on the files which are in this remote SSH box. So far, so good, right? So this basically allows us and gives us a story for running extensions remotely, which is kind of a step towards getting back to the browser, because the browser also, the extensions they run on a file system access, they need a remote story. So we could leverage, when we want to go back to the browser, we could leverage this VS Code server, right? What we need to add is we need to add support for HTTP, that you can request and load the code from the browser that runs this VS Code server. So the other challenge now when it comes to the browser, we were already running in the browser, right? Remember this Visual Studio Online Monaco. But what we did along the way as we moved to Electron, we leveraged the power of Electron that you can use from your code Node APIs, right? So the VS Code core used the Node API, the file system API to access the file system to spawn processes. When you want to run in a browser, of course, that's not possible. So we had to go back and basically remove this direct use of Node APIs and come up with an architecture that allows us to still have a single source implementation. And what's nice was this gives a great opportunity to clean up our code, right? Because this required no service injection, that we abstract different services like the dialog, so that on the desktop you get the native dialog, and in the browser you get an HTML built dialog. So this was another great achievement that brought us in 2020 again. It was a longer refactoring to get there, but at the end we had it. And this was then the last missing puzzle piece to get finally to the open in VS Code scenario. And of course, to get there was in a collaboration between the VS Code team, GitHub, and another team in Microsoft to make it working. Because what's the idea of this code spaces setup is that you get an environment that is managed by the infrastructure, right? For the WSL or remote containers or SSH, you manage, you bring your environment. Codespaces manages it for you, and it's nicely integrated in GitHub, right? So and there's now a preview available, and you can request early access to it. So that was very exciting. And of course, to connect the dots here, not only VS Code can run in GitHub, also GitHub can get closer in VS Code. And we do that by having what else? An extension that can integrate with GitHub and allows you to review GitHub pull requests and to review issues and so on, all in VS Code. So this is a major milestone in our journey, right? That we get this all connected. So let's look at where we are today, right? And it's I have some nice numbers for you here. So today we have 14 million monthly users. We have 28,000 extensions from 20,000 authors. We have a pretty good NPS score, right, with this NPS survey. So thanks to everybody that answers the surveys, which makes us pretty happy. We have some nice number of remote developers in this do-it-yourself setup with SSH and containers. You see here now language servers. There is kind of 138 LSP-based language servers available, which is pretty good. We do the same for debugger. We have a debug adapter protocol. We have over 50 adapters now that can implement the protocol that is needed to talk to the generic debugger we have in VS Code. And last but not least, I gave it a different color because what might be easy to overlook how intense this time is for us, right? So we closed, since we went open source on GitHub, we closed over 100,000 issues. And actually it happened just recently. So we just crossed the mark and nobody noticed. So almost sad. Okay, so as we went along, there are some things which are constant, we never changed, right? And one of the things we do, we ship every month. And this is true since 2011, we ship every month and we have release notes every month to show continuous progress. And this is, if you see here, we plan every month, we have a plan that is a GitHub issue, everybody can see it. And when you go to GitHub now, you see that we have closed 57 iteration plans, right? Which is quite a number. And what you also do, we want to have that the code is in good shape. So in every iteration, we do depth reduction for 1 week. We really practice listening. We look at highly voted feature requests and so on that we want to see where are the pain points from our users. And of course, we have continuous performance focus with tools that we have a bot that tells us when we got slower and so on. There is a whole separate talk behind how we manage to keep the performance up and running as we grow the tool. So where do we go from here? Same as iteration plans, we have a roadmap. The roadmaps are public. unfortunately, this time, this conference did not perfectly align with our roadmap work because the roadmap, the last one ends in 2020. We're currently working on a new one, but I can tell a little bit where we're working on, where the investment will go. A new area is testing. We have code editing, rich code editing support. We have debugging support. So what was missing in the whole cycle of developers testing? And we added that. Interestingly, we left this spot to the community, right? They filled it in. They were very creative. And what we do now, we go back to this community and work with them on testing infrastructure. So, and I can show you here a glimpse, right, how this is. This is now an extension which leverages the new testing support for our own VS Code repository and for our tests we run in there. And you see now we have that's kind of community inventions, right? They use code lenses that you can run your test. You can now also view from the gutter. When there's a test failure right in place, you see the error message, the failure of the test failure, and you can even see the difference, the delta between the expected and the actual value. So that's that will come. We'll invest in, and there's great progress on that. Of course, that will also enable the community to contribute then different test runners, different test frameworks. So we'll continue, of course, rely on the community to help us to make this a rich experience. Notebooks is very important, right? Like Jupyter. And what you work on is to get really first-class integrated and notebook experience in VS Code. By first class, we mean it supports VS Code extensions like the key bindings, if you use Vim key bindings, they work in a notebook, the themes, they work in a notebook, and then you can even extend the renders in the notebooks using VS Code extensions. It's a pretty nice story, and there'll be a talk later today from the Python team how they leverage this work. And last but not least, now we will continue, of course, to make code spaces better and to make this baby ship, help to make this baby ship. So this brings me to the end, and basically to summarize what it takes to create an overnight success, right? So I hope you saw from our journey, there was some ingredients you have to have, right? First of all, you have to be patient, right? We wanted to ship a web ID in 2013, but technology was not ready. Many things were not ready. We were just too early, so we had to be patient. However, you also have to be persistent, right? Don't give up, right? So even if it didn't happen, don't give up to come back to it. What's very important is be fit. What I mean, your code has to be ready. Whenever there's an opportunity, your code has to be in good shape that you can jump in and make it happen, right? But this is nicely what we showed when you made the pivot from the browser to the desktop, right? Because the code was fit, well structured, we could make this happen. Be willing to pivot, right? Be willing to abandon something and start something new. Of course, you were lucky we could leverage a lot of the work we had done. But keep in mind, what makes me thinking, how many active users would we have? We would have kind of not pivoted and tried to continue on the web ID in 2030. And last but not least, right? If you want to create an overnight success, you have to be lucky because things just have to align, right? Microsoft has changed, technology became in place. And if you build this all together, then that explains how we could build this nice success in 10 years. So this brings it to the end of this talk. And as always, we end the talk with the invitation for happy coding. So Brian, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent session. And we have a moment to at least do a quick question and answer really quick. So one, I love the name of the talk, and it's you have me laughing that I know you're joking around that it's an overnight success with VS Code, and it's amazing to hear of the history of the evolution of it overall. So with that in mind, though, and all that experience that you have gotten building out VS Code with the team, what would you potentially do differently if you could start from scratch?
Let me get some time by telling you what I would not change. Right?
Okay. Yeah.
I think what really helped us is that we started with the web in mind, right? We started as a web IDE, and why this has helped us so much is because we always had a focus on performance, right? In the web, you have HTTP requests, right? If you just started to use Electron, you have the file system. You can just access directly. But when it comes to the web, you care about bundling, because you care about reducing number of HTTP requests, you care about reducing the number of round trips to get performance. And I think this is really an explanation why we have a good startup performance, that we really started web first and then came to the desktop and not the other way around. So I would not change that, even though it would have kind of shortened the development. I think what I would change, well, of course, now we work monthly. So if something is wrong, we replan every month, right? So big changes we will correct. There is one conceptual change, if I look back, that I think has caused some confusion in the community. We didn't spend not enough time to come with the name of the open source core of VS Code, right? So we just called it Code Open Source. And I think Chrome did a better job, right? They have Chrome as the product, the distro, and Chromium as the open source core. And we don't have such a nice, cool name. And which has caused some confusion. And I guess that's something if you had more time, we could have done. But to be fair, right, the name VS Code came up 5 days before we shipped. So we were happy to have one name. Keep in mind, to have two good names, that would be almost be asking for too much.
Gotcha. Well, fantastic. Thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing what you all have in store for VS Code in the future.
Thanks for having me here.
Excellent.